Welcome back. The Uniform Law Commission is drafting legislation that would give family members the right to access their deceased loved ones' social media and email accounts, sparking the question, who should have the right to our digital lives after we've died? Joining us on Skype out of Chicago, Illinois is Ben Orzeski, Legislative Counsel for the Uniform Law Commission. And from Dallas, Texas, Carl Szabo, Policy Counsel for the group NetChoice. And one of the things he focuses on is privacy issues. Thanks for being here, gentlemen. Ben, the ULC is proposing laws to govern a person's online materials after they die. What would your law do, and why do you think it's necessary?
Well, it's necessary because in the pre-digital world, we had a well-established process for distributing the property of people when they die. It goes to a probate court, and there's a person appointed to administer the estate of the deceased, and they distribute that property as the deceased wished it in his will, or if no will, then to the heirs. In the digital world, things are working differently. Much of our property is now online. Our photos, instead of in albums, now we store them on the internet. And the same thing with our documents. They're not in file cabinets anymore. They're online, either on a hard drive or in the cloud somewhere. And our executors will likely need to access that information. So what the law does is it gives the ability to the account holder, to you and I who have these online accounts, to say in our will or our trust or our estate plan where we want this information to go after we're gone.
So, Carl, under this proposed legislation, though, if a person doesn't make a choice about how their digital material is to be used or not used after they die, it defaults to everything being available and going to next of kin. Do you have reservations about that?
It's a great question, and of course I do. One of the problems is that most Americans actually die without a will. More than half of Americans today don't have a will. So the idea of designating where our stuff goes in a will just doesn't really work. So the idea that the state will come in and say, well, all of your emails, all of your communications, all of your Twitter posts, all of your Facebook messages are just exposed when you die, I think that really strikes a tough chord with those of us who consider the privacy of our users to be a top priority. And what I would rather see is, rather than the state coming in and setting the default privacy standard to 0, to allow the users and the custodians and the services that they interact with to kind of take hold and get the first crack at what the user's privacy should be, rather than setting the bar at the bare minimum to make the life easier for a couple of trust and estates attorneys.
Well, Lisa, we asked our community what are the pros and cons of allowing family members access to your social media profile. Most of our community, like Dan says, wow, I never even considered that. This is a brave new world for them.
Exactly.
And we have,
point.
and Webpage FX, this is a great infographic. It talks about the digital demise. 30 million Facebook users died in the first 8 years of its existence. The questions to ask yourself: who owns my data? How long until deactivation? Can others claim my username? And what happens when a friend or family member passes? And this is the Google page. It's the inactive account manager for those of you using Google if someone passes away. This is Facebook. How do I report a deceased person or an account that needs to be memorialized? How do I remove the account? And even Twitter has something, contacting Twitter about a deceased user.
Yeah, but all of this is so confusing.
Yeah, well, it's confusing for us
because
we never think about it. I've never thought about this. Has made me think about my digital mortality, if you will. And look, check this out. This is USA.gov. It encourages us to write a social media will. Take these steps to help you write a social media will. Lisa, I have not even written my regular non-digital will. So Ben, the question goes to you. Tupac Shakur allegedly died in 1996. He's been releasing albums almost for the past 20 years. 2 years ago, he ends up as a hologram at a concert. I mean, his digital presence, I've taken it to the extreme limit of what you can do with the digital life. I mean, is the only way forward for the average citizen to write a social media will to control your digital footprint and identity after death?
That's certainly a recommended option. You know, Tupac had written a will. Perhaps he would have said he didn't want that to occur with his assets after he was gone. But I'd like to distinguish something that Carl said. There's a difference between granting access to a trusted fiduciary and making private information public. For long before the digital age, people died with embarrassing information, and just because a fiduciary may have access to that information, it doesn't mean that that information then gets revealed to either the public or to family members. The trusted fiduciary is somebody who can delete that information when appropriate, close those accounts. And the issue is really not whether your information remains private after you're gone, but who decides whether your information remains private. As it stands right now, the internet companies, Facebook, Yahoo, Google, they decide through their terms of service agreement who has access to that information and whether it remains public or private.
Carl, how is this different than, letters under the bed or a journal or a locked file cabinet full of documents that family would have access to once a person dies?
So that's a great question. And a lot of the trust and estates attorneys that I discussed this with analogize getting access to all of my emails as like the letters in my closet. But emails are very different. Consider the fact that rather than keeping a box full of my letters in my closet, I instead handed them to my friend David. And I said, David, when I die, I want you to delete all those letters. I want you to burn them. Well, the trust and estates attorney can definitely go through my dresser, go through my closet and look for the letters, but he can't kick in the door at David's house and go through David's stuff. That's what the trust and estates bar is trying to do here today. But I want to go back to an interesting point that was just raised a couple minutes ago. It's important to note that the iPad's only 4 years old, and the iPhone is only 7 years old, and Google's not even old enough to vote. And when we were creating these innovative services, we weren't really thinking about users' end of life. But we are now, and we are creating new tools and new innovations to give users specific control over what happens to their accounts when they die. The reference was made to the Google Inactivity Manager, the Facebook Memorialize. Even Yahoo is dabbling with some inactive account manager technology in Japan right now. So the industry is evolving very quickly. And I'd rather see the industry give users the control rather than having the state determine what happens to my emails and my content when I die.
Speaking of the state, Ben, I'm curious. ULC is going state by state rather than seeking uniform federal legislation on this issue. Why is that?
The ULC works with issues that are governed at state law, and trust the states are one of those. When you die, it's a matter of state law how that property gets distributed. So really, it's necessary to work in the states, but this is one area where the law should be uniform from state to state because digital assets cross state lines so easily.
Is it possible, because you're talking about companies like Google and Yahoo and global companies, is it possible to create something like this at a federal level just to keep everything the same across the board?
Conceivably, it might be possible. I don't see anybody, including the internet companies themselves, lobbying Congress for that to happen at this point. And so we're going to work with the existing law that we have in the states for now. Carl mentioned Google's inactive account manager. I agree with Carl on that, and I commend Google for providing that choice to their consumers. I think that when the law, UFADA, is enacted in the states, it will defer to those choices that consumers make through a service like Google's inactive account manager. But as far as I know, they're the only company right now that has done that. And the only reason that companies are moving in that direction is because of legislation like the Uniform Fiduciary Access to Digital Assets Act that is going to override some of the terms of service agreements that maybe they would prefer people didn't know about.
We have Muhammad here on Twitter. He goes, privacy should be constituted by the individual, whether dead or alive. Carl, let's do a middle ground here. We need estate planning. This is a brave new world, but how can we balance it with privacy rights? Quickly, your final thoughts.
Great question. There is a way to move forward. First, we need to respect the privacy interests of the user. Industry is giving users more control. Second, if we are going to move forward, unfortunately, the bill that came out of the Uniform Law Commission isn't the way to do it. I would defer and recommend people look to the existing law in Rhode Island that's been around since 2011, because one of the issues that has yet to be discussed is the issue of federal preemption. There's a federal privacy law that preempts all states.
All right.
And unfortunately, the Uniform Law Commission hasn't yet addressed it.
And
So
much
once again,
to still consider on this issue. I'm sorry, gentlemen, we're out of time, but I want to thank you both so much for your insights. Ben Orzeski and Carl Szabo. Still ahead, how average locals